And I just got off. We had an hour-long conversation with one of our local congressman's head staff member, Smith staff member on foreign policy, a guy by the name of Piero Tosi, where we were pressuring him on what to do. What is his office going to do about U.S. leadership and budgets and staffing and so forth? So that's kind of another way of getting involved. I know you guys have your own organization, and you can do political campaigns and so forth, but there's a lot of non-governmental organizations, maybe similar to yours, to get involved in. So I just mentioned that because it just happens. So, and I think you guys have some questions for me, and I saw you had some example questions. So why don't you go ahead and let me know what you want to talk about.
Okay. I want to start off with youth political involvement. So what can a high school student like us and others, what can they do to get involved in the political process during this coronavirus pandemic in these circumstances?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would have to say that although my heart goes out to people affected by the virus and people stuck inside, like it looks like all of us are, I think a lot of business is still going on. So I don't think the virus has put politics on hold, or a lot of, like I just had this meeting with the congressional staff member. Congress is still meeting. The United Nations is not meeting as much, but I would expect that would pick up. So I think, probably your classes are meeting, right? My classes are still going on. So the virus does change the nature of how we interact, but I don't think it's slowed down the amount of interaction. And in fact, I think somewhat it's drawn more attention to the role of government or governing institutions in having them prepared and robust and able to address crises like this. So I think, I hate to look for a silver lining in it, but I think one silver lining is that people have become aware of the importance of public institutions, both at the national level, and then going down at the state level, but also the international level as well too. So I think there are opportunities, and I don't think the virus has stopped that. It's changed things quite a bit, but it hasn't. I don't think it's slowed stuff down. In terms of you getting involved, probably the biggest challenge you face is that you're under 18 and you cannot vote, right? So your Congress members are not as likely to pay attention to you unless you can promise your parents vote or something like that. But that really is the currency in which they trade. So when we met with the staffer, we not only pressed him on our opinions, but we also offered his office an opportunity for outreach, right? We're a grassroots organization. We can inform his constituents about what he's doing, for good or for bad. So it wasn't just us as a dozen people in the room, but it was potentially the people who we could reach out to and inform. And I think you can do that too, right? And so you are, you're able to influence voters, and you're able to influence your cohort, who in, I would guess, 2 years will be eligible to vote. And so that would be, you can do publicity campaigns and so forth, but a lot of what politicians in a democratic society want to hear is where are the votes, right? Which sounds, I don't know, sounds cruel, sounds, but it's true. And that's a good thing in a democracy. That is the responsiveness of democracy. So a lot of different things you can do, but to the extent that you can deliver voters, right? And a lot of voting today is not changing people's opinion, but getting people to turn out. That's where I think you would have the most leverage.
Going off of what you said about how, of course, our abilities are limited as we can't really vote because we're under voting age.
And I'm sorry about that, but that's just the reality. Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think it's important for youth to be still involved in politics, even though they can't vote.
Oof. All right, I have another cruel comment, and I'll apologize ahead of time. Even when you do turn 18, the likelihood is you will not vote, right? And probably not the three of you because you're politically engaged, but if you think of your colleagues, I don't have the stats on hand, but I think people between the ages of 18 and 25 are the least likely to vote, right? And that's alarming, right? And there's rational reasons for that, right? You're caught up in college or a career. Um, Not all your cohort is as mature as you in understanding the importance of politics. So just as a large group, that's a block that does not vote. So I think in terms of political engagement, if you can get people your age to think about voting now, and then when they turn 18 to register and actually show up at the polls and make somewhat of a halfway informed decision, I think that would go a long ways. Right? If you look at the Bernie Sanders campaign, right, relied a lot on the youth vote, and it wasn't there. Right? People supported Bernie, but they didn't get up and go to the polls. And so I think that would be the most impact you could have. I might say getting the right people to vote too, but I'm going to keep my political opinions out of it.
Going back to coronavirus, with
Mhm.
elections coming up and primaries still going on,
Mhm.
how do you think the pandemic will impact elections in the fall? And how do you think people can mitigate the negative impacts if there are any?
Well, I mean, there are still primaries, but that's pretty much over, I think, right? We know who the two candidates are. And there'll be a convention of some sort for each party, which I would guess would be virtual. It's hard to predict what's going to go on with the virus, right? We don't know what's going to happen in mid-May or in June, much less in November. I would hope there is an election with a lot of participation. The initial data seems to suggest that a lot of people are going to participate. We had a lot of participation in the Democratic primaries. More people were coming out to vote than in previous presidential elections, and I think that would be true on the Republican side as well too, not just the Democratic side. I think there are a lot of people who will vote. Hopefully we get to vote in person. If not, maybe we do it electronically or something. But I would be shocked if we did not have a presidential vote in November. That would be unprecedented and potentially dangerous for the country in terms of maybe creating political violence or, I think it would be worth it even if we had the virus to, well, I shouldn't say this because I'm not a public health expert, but to show up to vote, I think that's very important. So I'm pretty sure we will do that. Other countries have had it. South Korea had an election last week, and they were able to vote. So again, I don't think it's going to deter people from voting. I think a lot of people are mostly angry on one side or the other, and that's a good way to motivate people to vote. So again, I'm not sure the virus is going to impact the amount of people voting. It might impact how we actually do it if we have to distance and wear a mask and so forth.
So what do you think, going off of the coronavirus and your thoughts on that, what do you think are the next steps for the nation as the coronavirus period comes to a close? I know that's not exactly where our nation is at right now, but when we reach that point.
Well, there are states that are opening up, right? Georgia is open up for business. That may be a good idea or not a good idea. I would take a step back for a moment and look at what our government has done during the economic slowdown of the virus. We've had a massive stimulus package passed through Congress, right? Over $2 trillion. The U.S. Federal Reserve has stepped up its purchasing of bad loans. I think that was $2.3 trillion. So I think our political institutions have responded to the economic slowdown in a fairly appropriate way. And I think that is in contrast to if you look at European Union countries that have not been able to do the same thing. They haven't been able to borrow, right? Because they have a commitment to the euro. That's where the focus of their macroeconomic policy is, where our Federal Reserve doesn't really care about the value of the dollar. They care more about interest rates and the internal economy. So I think we've done better than that. Another country to look at would be Ecuador, which also has a huge coronavirus problem. And Ecuador in 2000 replaced their own currency with the dollar. So they are unable to borrow or to have a stimulus package as well too. So I don't know what the next steps are, but I think so far I would be fairly critical of what our government has done in terms of combating the virus. But in terms of addressing the economic slowdown, I think we've taken appropriate measures, and maybe more appropriate than other countries that are hamstrung to kind of a fixed currency and pegged currency and not able to change as much. But in terms of the next steps, I don't know. I hope to get outside sooner than later. But I know about as much as you do, going just as crazy as you are sitting inside. But I think so far, I think that's one of the things that we don't do often is give ourselves credit for some of these kind of not the most exciting policy packages. I mean, $2 trillion to me sounds pretty exciting. But I think compared to other countries, and that's, I'm a political scientist, so I study what countries do, whether it's good or bad. And I'm not necessarily a cheerleader for our own country, but I think our country has done a good job with the response to the economic slowdown.
Going to your work with the United Nations Association, what ways, when you're working with elected officials, what ways have you found most impactful to influence those elected officials to make certain decisions?
Sure, very well. We visit them in their offices, and we visit them in their little offices here. I've been to. I only have one congressman, but our organization is in several congressional districts. So I visited the offices of several congressmen and both of our senators. And here in New Jersey and in Washington, D.C., we have a convention for the United Nations Association every year in June. We're not having it this year, obviously, in Washington, D.C., and we lobby members of Congress. We go in, we have information about the benefits of the United Nations. We have information about the preferences of their voters. Voters generally support the UN, especially if they have accurate information about it. And we go in and we present that to them. And we don't always talk to the congressman or senator directly. A lot of times we're talking to a staffer, but sometimes that's more influential than talking to the congressman himself, because the staffers are the ones doing the work, right? The congressman or senator has to do a lot of fundraising, is really kind of a public figure, certainly is the one who makes decisions, but a lot of those decisions are based on the information and action of a full-time staffer. So for example, today we met with the person who's in charge of foreign policy for Chris Smith's office, right? And he is the one who is actually meeting with UN officials, and he knows the budget figures the best, and he meets with foreign leaders. He's met with the head of the WHO, for example, which was part of our topic, right? So we go in and we pressure them directly, and that's one thing that we do. Another thing that we do is we have 2 or 3 events per year that are open to the public, and we talk about the importance of the UN, and that also feeds into our efforts to pressure legislatures. Right? We're like, hey, we had 300 people attending this event, supporting this. They're your potential voters. What can you do to show that you're on their side? So is kind of generating public support for the United Nations, and then conveying that to members of Congress. And typically they're not opposed to it. I mean, there are some, right? This particular person was a China hawk, right? It was one of those people who wants to beat up on China and wasn't a fan of the WHO and so forth. But for the most part, they're just torn in many directions, and they don't realize the importance of it, right? They're torn about student college loans, right? They're torn about unemployment insurance. They're pushed in many different directions, and there's not a lot of anti-UN people out there, although there's some. Our president might be one. But we have to say, hey, this is an issue of importance that you haven't been paying attention to, and your voters think it's important. And that's kind of the essence of lobbying, right? Or at least we're not a corporation. We don't have deep pockets. We don't make campaign contributions. That's another type of lobbying. What we do is try to bring public opinion into the calculus of the elected officials, and that seems to work, I think.
I think you mentioned earlier how about Trump's decision to pull the WHO funding. So how do you think that will impact our nation's standing with the UN and with other countries?
Yeah, it's a horrible decision. It's an unclear decision exactly what he means, right? He's putting a stop on WHO funding. He put no numbers on it. We have a mandatory contribution to the WHO, an assessed contribution. And on top of that, we have a voluntary contribution. This is part of the State Department and International Organization budget. It's unclear if he can do that, right? Because budgets are passed by Congress, for your Constitution, right? That they're in charge of that. So it's, I would be quite critical in that this was just more of the president's hot air without much thought behind it or strategy. In terms of the impact of not funding the United Nations or criticizing the United Nations, Trump has done more of this, but Obama did it too, and Bush did it as well too. So it's a persistent problem, and it opens up influence by other countries. Right. So ironically, in this case, the China has contributed everything to the WHO that we are likely to suspend. Right. And so that's put China in a position of influence. And China's going to have more pull over the WHO. They're going to be able to appoint more people into the WHO and the UN, right? More political appointees. So our inconsistency of support for the United Nations plays into the hands of our adversaries, China and particularly Russia as well too, right? And other countries who aren't our adversaries, but every country in international relations is somewhat competitive, right? So you have to look at that. So I view it as very disastrous. It's not done for any rational reason. It's done so that the president can appeal to a certain constituency that does not like things foreign, right? And they don't know exactly what they don't like about things foreign, but here's something that resonates with them, right? He's pulling money from the WHO that shows he's in charge, nominally, but ironically that goes against his campaign to lessen the international influence of China. Right? I mean, the United Nations is a U.S. created organization to promote U.S. interests. Right? It's headquartered in UN and in New York. Roosevelt and FDR were instrumental in creating it. And it's largely supported by the U.S. It is a U.S.-led organization that has great influence. There's no sense in shooting ourselves in the foot and not providing for that influence. That's a good question, though.
Yeah. Staying on the topic of international relations, how do you feel that this pandemic will impact relationships between countries, given travel bans and economic changes due to the pandemic?
Yeah, it certainly has slowed down the global economy, right? Drastically, and trade and investment. And it's had a big impact, and I don't know how that recovers. Right, it recovers slowly. I think that's, investors and consumers need to have confidence in things, and And so I think a lot of it is waiting for people to get confident about economic interactions again and international economic interactions. So I think it remains to be seen what's going to happen there. It's also spreading to poorer countries that do not have the public health resources that we have, and that's going to be very painful. I mean, they're likely to have more deaths than we will, and they also have a lot of other problems going on, right? Other diseases that the WHO vaccinates people for that is not happening now, and other problems. There's I don't know if you read about a few months ago, there was a problem of locusts spreading throughout Africa, right, which destroys the food supply. There's another wave of locusts coming up that's going to be somewhere between 20 times greater to 400 times greater. That's going to destroy food supplies throughout northern Africa, the Sahel region, unless that's fumigated now, and is not being fumigated because of kind of some of the slowdown in international cooperation. So, I mean, there's kind of two stories, I guess. There's the stories of economic recovery in the wealthy world, which I think will happen and won't be too bad. And then I think there's the economic and health impact in the developing world, which I think will be far worse.
Speaking of economic recovery, how do you think, this is kind of a broad question, but how do you think we can bridge the divide in healthcare access between low-income minority communities and others?
A lot of ways. Our country has very poor health outcomes, right? And yet we spend a lot more money. We spend I think it's about $8,000 per person per year on healthcare. European countries spend half of that, and they get better health outcomes in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, those sorts of issues. So there certainly is a smarter way to do it. Cuba has similar health outcomes to us, and they spend under $200 a person. So we're getting the same amount of results that countries spending, much less get. Healthcare is a really complicated policy issue. You're dealing with insurance pools and finance, which you guys study, right? And when you study the kind of financial models of an insurance pool and who's in and who's out, and some people are riskier than others, there's better ways to go about it. We live in a part of the United States where some of the main corporate beneficiaries of healthcare are pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, and it seems like a lot of the money goes to them instead of to healthcare. I'm not a Bernie Sanders socialist. I wouldn't socialize all healthcare, but I think there's some practical steps to make it more accessible to people. A lot of our bad healthcare options are because roughly 20% of our population has no healthcare, and that's just it doesn't have to be. So I think kind of getting away from the ideological part of healthcare, that is either the private sector, the socialist model. I think government spending, if you include tax incentives to provide employees for healthcare, I think about 70% of the healthcare budget goes through the federal government already. So maybe it already is kind of socialized. It's certainly not a private sector model, right? It's some messy model in between. And there's solutions to it. I'm not an expert on that, but I do know just from traveling around to other countries that things could be vastly better. Right? Doesn't answer your question, sorry.
No, that was great. Thank you.
So another final question on coronavirus. What do you make of the protests that are happening in various states against these restrictions? And what do you think the impact of these protests will be, if any?
Well, I think they have had an impact, right? Where the protests have happened, we're looking at Texas and Missouri, And Florida, there's been some lifting of the restrictions. So I think they have had an impact. We're a democratic country and people can protest whatever they want. And even if I don't agree with their views, I do agree with their right to protest. I think it's an expression of democracy. Democracy is a very ugly process when you get down to it. Right? Democracy involves arguments, sometimes it involves political violence, right? And it involves, hopefully it involves some tolerance, but there's a lot of intolerance in democracy too. I don't agree with the lifting of restrictions, although I don't agree with some of the restrictions as well too. I'm somewhere in the middle. But I think that those movements have impacted those states a little bit, for better or for worse.
We're just going to, I guess, wrap this up. Thank you so much.
Sure.
One final question would be, what is your advice, I guess, not only for youth, but for members of our community and our world while we're going through this crisis? What do you think is most important at this time?
Well, certainly take care of your health, right? And not just your physical health, but also your mental health and that of the other people in your household. It is a stressful time for people. But at the same time, life is not stopped, right? And we will emerge from this, or maybe not, right? It might take a year or two. But in the meantime, I think you need to do things just like what we're doing now. We still need to meet and talk like we would otherwise. We still need to get our work done as much as possible. We need to continue. So we need to, kind of take care of ourselves and others in our family and community, but at the same time, not just throw up our hands and say, all right, I'm going to lay on the couch for the next few months, right? You have to engage and get out and do things and stay active and make a difference. And I applaud you guys for trying to do that. And to get back to my earlier comments, what you need to do is to talk to the 17-year-olds that you know and tell them the first thing they need to do on their birthday is to register to vote, and then to get their butt up to the polls.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. Okay. Look forward to talking to you guys in the future.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.